Hello everyone. So it's been 9 years since I last put up a video in my genealogy playlist. At that time, my YouTube channel had only just started. I didn't have a great many subscribers, and the genealogy playlist was not didn't get a lot of traction, let's put it that way. Hardly any views. So because I was still pursuing my own family tree, but it was going quite slowly, I didn't deliberately stop, make the intention of stop adding to that playlist, but it ran out of steam, basically, is what I'm trying to say. But anyway, one of the things, I'm sure, if you have adopted the hobby of genealogy and have been tracing your own family tree, one of the things I'm sure you'll have found, like myself, is that you go through an initial period of finding lots of information and adding to your family tree, getting very engrossed in it. But as time goes by, it gets harder and harder to access new sources, to find new information. And what happens is that you get the odd little snippet that you can add to your tree. You get obviously life events in your family, births, deaths and marriages that you can update your tree with. Over the course of the last 9 years, the main extra bit of information that has happened in that time period has been the release of the 1921 census in the UK, which was released in 2021. I found that didn't really get me a lot farther, mainly because I had already had a lot of information of the whereabouts of various members of my family in 1921. Didn't really sort of excite me that much. It gave me a little bit more information, but didn't really add anything new to what I knew already. So as I say, what happens basically is that you just sort of let the thing sort of bubble along in the background, and every now and again you come across a new an added bit of information. In my case, what happened was that I was doing my usual trawl of the charity bookshops in Plymouth yesterday, and I came across this book, the South African War Honours and Awards 1899 to 1902. Now, I haven't got any particular military history interest in the Boer War, the Second Boer War, but I was interested in picking this book up. At first glance, even to a military historian, it doesn't seem to provide a great deal of added interest, but you will notice that what it is all the relevant pages from the London Gazette regarding the Second Boer War, published in book form. And it's so long ago now, 9 years ago, that I can't remember if I actually did mention the London Gazette as a very useful source of genealogical information. In this particular case, it's just looking at military matters, honours and awards and distinctions and so on. But there is also in the London Gazette are published notifications of bankruptcies and so on, financial misdemeanors and what have you. So it's a bit of a weird conjunction that you get. You can find family members who have distinguished themselves in the various conflicts that have happened right the way back to the Victorian era, but going through to the present day. Also titles and OBEs, MBEs, that kind of thing. But you can also find details of financial affairs. If any of your family members have got into financial difficulties in the past, which they, you know, it may have been something that they didn't want to advertise to their descendants and so on. But I have it, not in my own personal family tree, but researching the family tree of a friend of mine. I found some of his relatives, or one particular relative of his in there, whose business went bankrupt back at the beginning of the 20th century. Anyway, I digress. What I wanted to talk to you about today is, in particular, the Boer War and whether any of your relatives might have been involved in the Boer War. If they were involved, it's not to say that they would appear in a book like this, because this book is just about awards and military distinctions and so on. So it's not to say that they would necessarily appear in this book. But if, like me, you have relatives that you knew were around in 1901 but don't appear on the census, what I would suggest to you is consider the fact that they were in South Africa. Now, let me just take you across to my computer screen. And so what I wanted to do was show you this family tree of mine, and as I say, there are a number of people on this tree, and you might find the same, who I just cannot find in the 1901 census. Now, one, if you go, here am I, Ralph Anthony Astley. If you go up to my great-grandfather James Astley here, and then back down his tree to his children, here are his children. This is Robert Astley here, who was my father's uncle, so he's my great uncle. I knew from my father that Robert Astley had served in the Boer War. So it didn't surprise me that I couldn't find him on the 1901 census. So he is the principal person that I'm going to talk to you about today. Give you a little bit of a story about his life. But before I go on to him, just want to talk about a couple of other people. One of them is James Astley himself, who to this day, and even now, I don't know where he was in 1901, but I have found some military records for a J. Astley, who served in the Boer War. He would have been quite elderly by the time of the Boer War, in his 40s. So, you know, was he there or not? I just don't know. I haven't found any evidence to prove that he was. It's just, it strikes me as being an odd coincidence that he and his son Robert are both missing from the 1901 census, and I have definite knowledge of my great uncle Robert serving in the Boer War, so possibly. But the other person is, we have to go right back to me and back up my mother's side. Arthur Ernest Heath, who was my grandfather, who likewise is missing from the 1901 census. Now, in his case, I was very familiar of the fact that he had served during the First World War. In fact, I never knew him because he died in 1937. Let me just show you his death certificate here. And you can see that one of the causes of his death is actually listed as debility as prisoner of war, 18th of January 1918. So he came back. He was captured during the Kaiserschlacht. He was in, I think it was the 5th Battalion of the King's Royal Rifle Regiment, taken prisoner, gassed and then taken prisoner in the early hours of the March 1918 offensive. Why I think they've got the 18th of November there is that was the day that he was repatriated to Dover. It's actually got the 1st of November 1918 there. But his name should be on here somewhere, otherwise there's no reason why. Oh, where are we? There he is. Private A.E. Heath, 8th Battalion, King's Royal Rifle Corps, rather than the 5th Battalion, which I said a moment ago. Anyway, I knew that from my mother telling me that he died because his lungs never really recovered from the gassing. So he was quite young when my mother was quite young when he died. But it just puzzled me why I couldn't find him on the 1901 census. And years after I'd given up looking for him, I came across some of his military service records for the First World War, and I actually discovered, tacked onto all this, I think it was on Ancestry .com website, can't remember now. It might have been, what's the name of the other one? Find My Past. It might have been on Find My Past. Anyway, I found some of this army paperwork for Arthur Ernest Heath joining. I know this is him for a fact because this is his address. On another page, there is a list of some of his dependents and so on, so I can marry it all in. I know for a fact this is my grandfather, and you can see on one of these pages here that he actually joined up for the Royal West Surrey Regiment in 1900. So whether or not he actually got to South Africa, I don't see any reason why he wouldn't have done. This is one other. Oh yeah, he did. Yeah. So there you are. There, that is proof that he was actually in South Africa. Now, my mother never mentioned that. No one ever mentioned that. None of my mother's brothers or sisters, my aunts and uncles mentioned that. Um, but this is my point, that if you are missing details of one of your relatives in the 1901 census, then consider the fact that they might have been present in South Africa. They might have been in South Africa at the time that the census was taken, and that is why they are missing. Um, and what a coincidence, really! What that's a sizable number of that generation of my family. Um, so there's my grandfather, and there's Richard Astley, my grandfather's brother Robert, both in South Africa. From that generation alone in my family. So it's more it's a more likely occurrence than you might at first think. You might think of the Boer War as being, a fairly obscure colonial affair, in an imperial war, and you might expect generations that were alive during the First and Second World Wars to have been in the services. Doesn't it doesn't seem so likely for the Boer War, but there we are. That's proof it is. And then you've also got my great grandfather James Astley, who might also have been in South Africa, but never been able to prove it. Anyway, let's get on to Robert himself, because knowing from my father that he had served in the Boer War, I had researched quite a lot of this way back, and I now cannot remember, and this is really remiss of me, where I got these details from. It was on the internet. I didn't. I cut and pasted it out into a Word document, and it was really remiss of me that I didn't actually write down the source. But anyway, where I got it from, the source that I got it from cited their source as being J.B. Haywood and Sons Gazetteer. So Astley R, soldier number 5411, 2nd Battalion, the King's Own Royal Lancaster Regiment. This is him. He was wounded slightly on the 26th of September 1901 at Itala Fort. Never heard of Itala before. Wasn't a name that I was familiar with in regard to the Boer War. But there's a few little details about it here. So there's a mission station in Zululand, Natal Colony, 14 kilometres south of Baba Nango. During the second Boer incursion into the Natal Colony, Commandant General Alberta Lagered at Baba Nango sent Assistant Commandant General C. Bertha on the 25th of September 1901 with some 1,400 burghers to storm the fortified British post at Itala on the eastern slopes of Itala Mountain. It was occupied by 300 men of the 5th Division Mounted Infantry and 2 guns of the 69th Battery Royal Field Artillery under the command of Major A.J. Chapman, Royal Dublin Fusiliers. On receiving warning of the Boer advance, the peak of Itala Mountain was manned by 80 mounted infantrymen under Lieutenant B.P. Lefroy, 1st the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, and Lieutenant H.R. Kane, 1st the Prince of Wales Volunteers South Lancashire Regiment. At midnight, Bertha first attacked the detachment on the summit, which put up stout resistance and fought for over an hour before it was overwhelmed. The garrison thus had time to prepare for an attack which came about 2 a.m. and for the next 2 hours repeated Boer rushes were repulsed. During the day, the burghers maintained a sporadic but accurate fire on the British defences from their positions on the mountain above the camp. Faced with this resistance, Bertha withdrew his burghers that evening, and Chapman, having provided for the wounded, withdrew from the camp at midnight, retiring to his base at Nkandla. The British lost 22 killed, including Kane, and 59 wounded. Driver F.G. Bradley, 69th Battery Royal Field Artillery, was awarded the Victoria Cross for carrying a wounded soldier to safety under heavy fire. Boer losses were 15 killed, 40 wounded, and 1 missing. Among the dead were Commandant JSF Blignaut, Swaziland Police, and Captain P.J. Schatz, Virid Command Scout Corps, excuse my pronunciation. And yeah, it runs into a little bit of gobbledygook there that I don't understand. But anyway, that's a sort of brief description of the action at Itala. And my great uncle was actually involved in that fight. Now, I'm going to take you back to my desk and show you what else I discovered from this book that I purchased yesterday. And show you a little bit of something from another book I've got, which is on the subject of the King's Own Royal Regiment Lancaster. So in this book here, there's a little bit more information on the defence of Itala. This is in Lord Kitchener's mentions. So basically he will draw attention to units rather than the army commander, will draw attention to units rather than, or not necessarily, specific individuals. And you can see here the Royal Lancaster Regiment 2nd Battalion, Sergeant J. King with 14 men held an advanced trench under heavy crossfire and repulsed the enemy. He and 8 men were killed or wounded. Private C. Lowndes, promoted corporal, volunteered to carry ammunition to Hill and wounded in doing so. Previously mentioned the gallantry at Vrihel, December the 11th. So I'm pretty confident now then that my great uncle, who was in the 2nd Battalion, we know now, was actually involved in this fight, and may even have been one of the 8 men who were killed or wounded. So obviously he was wounded. It's just this is what I was saying earlier about genealogy, that you start off with an enormous splurge, but as the years go by, it's a steady kind of trickle of small amounts of information. So while I've got this book open here, let me just talk a little bit about, read you a little bit from this history of the King's Own. It doesn't actually mention the fight at Itala. It's a fairly kind of precede description of the war in general, but it might be Itala was, no, this is the 11th of December. Anyway, on the 11th of December, several companies of the 2nd Battalion successfully defended Lancaster Hill near Vrihel, which is that word I mangled earlier, against a determined Boer attack. For the remainder of the war, the battalion's role in northern Natal and Transvaal was guarding of lines of communication and the building and manning of the blockhouse system, which formed barriers to prevent cross-country movement by the Boers. In order to operate over long distances and deal with the widespread groups of Boers, mounted infantry units were formed. Now, this is the thing that I didn't mention earlier I think I read out that my great uncle was actually in a mounted infantry um, unit, and that always surprised me, given a little bit of his background, the fact that he was able to ride a horse. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit later in a moment, about his general family history. But anyway, it always struck me as surprising that I had a relative who used to ride a horse around in warfare. Both the second and third battalions formed the detachments in 1900. From the beginning of 1901, the war entered into a phase of guerrilla warfare until peace was signed on 31st of May 1902. The use of mounted infantry then became essential, since so many troops were tied down guarding strategic positions. In July 1900, the 1st Battalion started to train men for the mounted infantry units at Aldershot, the first of which arrived in January 1901. In all, nearly 450 officers and men from the 1st Battalion served with 5 mounted infantry battalions from February 1901 until December 1902. That doesn't include the 2nd Battalion, so it doesn't include my grand uncle. So that's the only mention there. So it was just to point out that it was my grand uncle was served in a mounted infantry unit, which I found interesting as well. Let's take you back to the family tree here on my laptop there, and want to talk a little bit more about where my grandfather and his brother Robert lived and worked and so on. So Robert, if I bring up his birth certificate, as you can see, was actually born in Wolverhampton. So was my grandfather Richard. They only moved to Lancashire around the end of the 19th century. They did so because, as you can see, James Astley was an iron worker. They tended to be heavily involved in the industry of the time, but when they moved up to Lancashire, they moved up to the mining communities up there, and they all became coal miners. Here's a picture of I got from, again, another website that I've lost the source of, but this is in the local area, Garswood. Picture of a group of colliery workers and families in that region of, it's kind of St Helens is probably the name most people are familiar with, but as you go a little bit further east, you come to Newton Le Willows, Ashton in Macclesfield, other smaller places like Haydock and Garswood and so on. I just like these photographs because they're contemporary photos from the time of my grandfather and his brother's life and work up there in Lancashire. So they would have rubbed shoulders with these people. They would have known them. Who knows? They might even, I've no idea what either of them looked like. So they might even be in these pictures, or one of these pictures. Very evocative, lovely photos. Apologies for not being able to point you in the direction of where I got them from, but it does give you a really nice feel of what people were like, life was like at the time. You can see a pretty hard existence. Now, the other thing that I knew about Robert was that he died shortly before my father was born. My father was born in 1912. His uncle had died a couple of years earlier, and I knew it was from a pretty grisly accident. And here is a copy of Robert's death certificate. 1910 in the sub-district of Newton in Macclesfield in the county of Lancaster. So he died on the 25th of September 1910 in the Cottage Hospital in Haydock. He was only 27, and he was a colliery brakesman of 9 Gibraltar cottages. Now I'm going to come back to Gibraltar cottages in a minute, but the cause of his death was injuries received on the previous day by falling from a wagon and being run over by train at Messrs Road Evans Sidings, Haydock. So cause of death was accident. My memory, it fades now, but basically I think my father told me that he lost his leg. He had his leg amputated, but in fact I think it was his arm. I've got a little bit more information here because the local library at St Helens very kindly looked up on their microfiche information for newspaper cuttings, and you can see here they sent me the local newspaper's report on the inquest into the accident. So there's a lot more detail here. So the story is fatal shunting accident. On Sunday morning, a colliery brakesman named Joseph Astley. Now, this is so kind of typical of what I've come across in my family research, that they've got the name well, not completely wrong, but only remotely correct, shall we say. So they've got his name as Joseph. I just haven't got a clue how they got that. Astley, commonly, misinterpreted, mistranslated. So that's quite common. But getting the name Robert mixed up with Joseph, I haven't got a clue how the reporter did that. They've got his age slightly wrong, age 29, but they've got his address correct, 9 Gibraltar Cottages. So he died in the Haydock Cottage Hospital from injuries sustained on Saturday afternoon. He was employed by Messrs E. Evans and Co. And on Saturday afternoon he was engaged in shunting operations when he slipped and one of his arms was run over. He was taken to the hospital where the arm was amputated by Dr. Thompson. About 1:30 on Sunday morning he collapsed and died from the shock. The poor fellow leaves a widow and 2 children. The inquest. The inquest was held on Tuesday before Mr. F.A. Jones, Deputy Coroner, Mr. Matthews, HM Inspector of Mines, attended the inquest, and Mr. Peace, Solicitor, represented the colliery company. Significant that. While Mr. J. Robinson, Manager, and Mr. R. Sudworth, Traffic Superintendent, were also present. Dorothy Rogers, a nurse from the hospital, stated that Ashley, when admitted to the hospital, was suffering from severe injuries to one of his arms, which Dr. Thompson amputated. William Fairhurst, an engine driver for Messrs Evans, said Ashley had been brakesman with him for about 8 months. On Saturday afternoon, they were in charge of an engine and some wagons. Deceased was riding in the front wagon of some others which were being pushed in front of an engine to which they were buffered. The train was travelling between 7 and 8 miles an hour. When they got through the points at the wood pit, witness saw Ashley get out of the front wagon onto the panels on the front brake. In trying to get inside, he appeared to overbalance himself and fall to the ground. Witness applied the brake to the engine and stopped within a very short distance. When he got down, he found the man lying with his left arm fast between the jack rails of the crossing, and the engine and 3 wagons had gone over his arm, which was almost severed from the body. Deceased had no right to get over the front of the wagon whilst the train was in motion. So what you're beginning to get here is, and remember that the company had a solicitor present as well, is that the colliery company, all privately owned in those days, remember, coal industry was only nationalised after the Second World War. But remember that they were basically trying to cover their tracks and to absolve themselves of any blame. Health and safety didn't exist in those days. So they just didn't want to feel any obligation towards paying any kind of injury allowance to the widow. In reply to Mr. Matthews' government inspector, witness said there was a man in the front brake van, and as they were all finishing and working to the shed, Astley might have been going to speak to the other brakesman. Albert Twist, fireman, gave corroborative evidence and said he did not know what Ashley's idea was in trying to cross from the wagon to the brake van. It was a very dangerous thing for him to do when the train was travelling 7 or 8 miles an hour. Mr. Sudworth, in reply to the coroner, said the man knew it was wrong to change from one train to another whilst they were in motion. He had placed written notice to that effect in brakesmen's cabins, but there was no specific printed rule prohibiting the men doing what Ashley did. There was not a rule stating that a man should not jump from one moving train into another. The coroner, it is obviously a wrong thing to do, and it is against common sense to do it. Under these circumstances, he added, it was for the jury to consider whether the man met his death by accident or not. The jury returned a verdict of accidental death. So Robert dies. Let me try and find his own family tree. So he was married to an Alice Jones. He had 2 children that I have been able to find, but one of them had actually died. When was the accident? It was in September, wasn't it? So he had actually died. He was only a couple of months old by the time of the press report. So the press report said that he left a widow and 2 children, but in fact there was only 1 child left, who was also named Robert. Now Arthur, who died in 6 months of age, was also the name of my father. So my father was an Arthur Astley. The family were clearly all quite closely connected. Before I go on to talk about that a little bit, and my father's kind of relationship to this affair, let me just show you this other picture that I didn't show you here, which is it's from the same location, but I don't know whether this is actually the colliery siding, but it's contemporary and in South Lancashire somewhere, this picture. But this is an example of the colliery sidings and the wagons and so on that my father, my grand uncle would have had his accident from. Anyway, I wanted to talk a little bit about this address here, which is the address of Alice Jones. My great uncle was living in 8 Athol Street at the time. But Alice Jones, this interested me, when they got married, in 1905, she was actually living at an address described as 9 the Jib. Now, you'll remember that Robert's address at the time of his death was given as 9 Gibraltar Cottages. This is the same address. My father was actually born in 1912 at number 12 Gibraltar Cottages. And I've always been interested, and only found out today where Gibraltar Cottages actually were. I had struggled for many years. I've got a lot of maps here, as you can see, old Ordnance Survey maps of the area. They are quite detailed, and I have spent many years scanning these maps, trying to find Gibraltar Cottages on them somewhere, and never been able to. And the reason for that is that this is quite a large area, and Gibraltar Cottages, I've now discovered today, isn't covered by any of these maps. It's just on the edges of and so on. The only one that it would be on is this much larger scale general map of the South Lancashire coalfields, and you can see, well, I think you can see that there is no chance of streets or specific roads or anything being shown on this map. It's the whole of South Lancashire. There's St Helens down there. That's Haydock there, which is where the hospital, cottage hospital was, and Gibraltar Cottages, I've now discovered, is just around here somewhere. And I will show you a little bit more about that in a moment. But the other thing that I wanted to say before I do forget entirely about my father's relationship to all this is that the family moved again. They'd already moved from Wolverhampton to this area at the turn of the 20th century. During the Depression, after the general strike of 1926, and remember that my father was only born in 1912, but he was already mining coal in 1926 at the age of 14, and so he is the only person I have ever known who took part in the general strike of 1926. But after the strike was over, sometime in the early 30s or the late 20s, the family moved again to Nottinghamshire and carried on coal mining around the sort of Shire Oaks area, Worksop, that kind of thing. And that is the area of the north, as we southerners kind of term the whole north from London. But that is the area of the north that I always associated his family with. In fact, even though his parents had moved from Wolverhampton, my father always considered himself a Lancastrian, and in 1932 he did a very similar thing to Robert, in that he decided to escape from coal mining, and he joined the army, and the regiment he chose to join was Robert's old regiment. He travelled to Lancashire and signed up with the King's Own Royal Regiment. So I'm sure it was his uncle, even though he'd never known him. It was partly the inspiration of his uncle's service in the Boer War that inspired him to join that particular regiment. Anyway, enough on him. But as I said earlier, my father was born in Gibraltar Cottages as well. Never been able to find where they were, and I knew pretty well that they were rough. Um, Never actually able to find out where they were though. But today, um, I found a really wonderful website, which is a history of the local area of Newton the Willows and Burton Wood and so on. Um, and in it, you can see there are local maps and drawings of the area. And the maps that I have, as I say, all kind of missed the particular area where this accident happened and so on, and where Robert lived with his wife Alice, and where my father was born, and and his family lived. And I found it today. So if we go to 1908, which is 2 years before Robert was killed, um, here's a map of Newton in Macclesfield. There is Haydock, just outside of the boundary. And this has always confused me in a way. I haven't shown you half of the certificates I've got, but there's always it seems to be a variance in where they describe the place. Gibraltar Cottages, you can see here the Gibraltar, right there, and it's in this sort of neck. This is the boundary of Newton and Willows, I think it is, or Earlstown. Newton and Willows. Gibraltar Cottages is kind of the length of the terrace of cottages is all included in within the boundaries of Newton and Willows, whereas the railway sidings and everything, I mean, this is almost certainly the railway sidings where Robert had his accident, is all in the sort of area of Haydock Colliery. Now, Haydock Colliery is probably the same one that was run by the Evans family. It has to be, doesn't it? Because Robert was taken to the hospital, the cottage hospital in Haydock. Haven't been able to find where that is. Has to be around here somewhere. I can't find it on the map. Maybe it's just off of the map here. But I was really pleased to find Gibraltar Cottages, and then having found it, I looked at some other maps. So you've got the 1891 map here, and not quite so easy to spot it in here. You have to search around a little bit, but you can see down here, there it is, Gibraltar, with the sidings, the houses. So it was in one of these. How many other? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I think that's 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Maybe I'm wrong then about my father being born at number 12. There only seem to be 11 houses there. Anyway, definitely the place. Right back in 1849, there it is. Gibraltar, the Gib. Wonder why it was called that. Was it because it was on a prominent outcrop of rock or something? The old coal pit, In 1849 there wasn't the same number of railway sidings and so on there, but it goes back, that actual row of buildings goes back years. I haven't explored all of these entirely. You got 1923. Not much change there. It's positioned within that neck. I'm just really going through all this really from the point of view of showing you the tools and sources that are available out there that you never think of using. I'm going to go into one more here. Yeah, that's no good. That's for electoral purposes for the Great Reform Act. Difficult to work out where we are on that one. And let's just, for the sake of completion, look at the 1960 map. So I was alive by this time. My father had married my mother and they were living in Croydon, which is where I was born. But did the house where he was born still exist at this time? Doesn't look like it. There's that familiar shape. Looks like his birthplace had been pulled down by that time. And on Google Maps, present day, you can see that the area is transformed again. There's very little, there's Haydock, very little to indicate that it was even such a heavily industrialised area at the time. The railway lines have gone, the sidings have gone. I'm imagining if this was Station Road that the jib and the railway sidings were somewhere in this area here. Almost impossible to work out. I'm just pausing there because I was saying it was wondering whether it was on a promontory and there is a hill there, but the old names have disappeared. No mention of Gibraltar anywhere there. Yeah. Anyway, that's the end of me waffling on. I just wanted to do. I was quite pleased with myself for having found Gibraltar on the map finally, and also that little bit of extra information about the regiment's service during the Boer War, and my great uncle's is it grand uncle or great uncle? I think it's great uncle. Anyway, his small involvement in it, and also the tragic story of his end. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. Bye for now.